Somos más americanos. We are more American. And of course, the Tigres del Norte here are making a little bit of a, how to say, a little bit of a joke, a little bit of Mexican nationalism joke, but they're trying to tell us about a kind of reality that people experience outside of the United States. And for those of you who've ever traveled in places in Latin America, and people are like, wait a second, why are you calling yourselves Americans? Or why do the people in North America or the United States call themselves Americans? When in fact, we're equally, or in the words of the Tigres, we are more American than you. And in the sense of, being a kind of a deeper history there. And they're also talking to us about a sort of an interesting reality, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is that much of the United States was actually Latin or colonized by the Spanish before it was ever Anglo. And so a couple of years ago, somebody was in a Colorado grocery store and some people were speaking Spanish and she got mad at them and said, "Speak English, this is America." And it's like, wait a second. You are in Colorado. How do you think your whole state got its name from? This has been explored and colonized, and for many years administered by the Spanish before it was ever administered by the Anglos. Now, of course, they're playing a little bit with history here. They're playing with a theme of Mexican nationalism, which talks about we'll talk about in a couple classes about the idea of mixture and how that forms a new kind of person or a new kind of race. It's a little bit, like I said, it's a little bit of a nationalistic vibe there, but it tells us about something which is of interest or of importance for how we're going to do this class. So this is the way that Sanabria begins his work, and why I think that Tigres del Norte is also a good introduction for us. He says that the historical and cultural destinies of North American and Lac peoples have been interwoven, and that's the key word here, interwoven in many ways for more than 200 years. Of course, the thing that kind of strikes me, I don't know if it strikes you, Lac peoples. Who are these Lac peoples? Latin Americans and Caribbean. So Sanabria has decided that he's going to give us this abbreviation. I put a question mark here because I'm not sure how I feel about it. It sounds a little bit, I don't know. I guess it's easier than writing out Latin American and Caribbean every single time you want to say it. But at the same time, I feel a little bit like, I don't know, how does it make you feel? Would you like to be called a Lac person? No, okay, a little bit, tiny bit weird. So I'm going to try and write it out most of the time, but for Sanabria purposes, for the textbook, we'll run with it for a while. Just want to draw attention to that. It's kind of a funny acronym, I would say. I guess you could say LAC peoples. That's not so strange. All right. So I want to talk about how we are interwoven, we being in the United States, interwoven with peoples and cultures in Latin America. So one of the areas that we are interwoven is the sort of demographic ideas. And actually, Lydia, you talked a little bit about some of the demographics and some of the statistics and the number of Spanish speakers and like people even around your house in some rural area. Tell us.
In my post, I guess that's what we're calling them. I just saw some of the numbers, like that it said there were more Spanish-speaking people in the United States than in Spain.
More Spanish speakers in the United States than in Spain. Whoa, yes, that was very striking. Go ahead.
Which is, I don't know, just kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Like what I said whenever we started taking languages in school, everyone said sign up for Spanish because and it's just going to be so much more important in your future than taking French or something like that. And the same kind of sentiment is like the author has that same idea. Yeah.
So part of the, yeah, sort of part of the ways in which it's a very striking, striking statistic, right? That we have more Spanish speakers in the United States than in Spain. That is, you know, obviously a growing and very diverse and spread out all over the country now population. So it's a sort of demographic intermingling. There's also sort of the economic intermingling. Louis, you notice this, who's a big trade partner of the United States?
Mexico was the third, and then China, no, Canada, and then China.
Right. So here we have Mexico being, you know, right up there with, you know, a huge trading partner. And despite all these ideas that we're going to build walls and shut the border down and all that stuff, if you notice, there was one time that Trump threatened to close the border, and they're like, no, you know, there'd be like 6-day backups of cars back and forth. So, you know, we'll probably see as things go on, maybe things will get nicer, but the economic stuff is completely interwoven and intertwined now. It's probably impossible to roll that back. Yeah, man.
Yeah, in the reading it said like it made up for about like 800 billion for the economy.
Yeah, so lots of money. 800 billion. We'll probably be able to round up to $1 trillion by now, a couple of years later. But yeah, actually, thank you. And I was just about to call on you for exactly that number. So we have sort of these raw sort of demographic and economic interconnections. And then we have a number of things that we might call cultural interconnections or cultural interwovenness. And so if you think about things like food, and that salsa has now surpassed the sale of ketchup in the grocery store, and all the sort of food influences that have come in. Music, I think Lydia mentioned the Bieber version of Despacito. You know, these kinds of ways in which, and I think, is J-Lo going to be singing tomorrow or tonight at the inauguration? So you can see that, or the last Super Bowl of J-Lo and Shakira gave us a performance. So there's a lot of musical influences, and obviously language or linguistic influences as well. The one thing I would like to add to this, or the thing that I want to emphasize here, is that we often hear about this as something that just happened. You know, like Bieber's singing Despacito, and Shakira's here, and now there's people coming in from these places. And what I want to sort of get at, and that's why another reason I wanted to introduce the class by way of the Somos, americanos, is that this is not just something that happened in the last 10 years or the last 20 years. This is something that has been going on for hundreds of years. And in fact, as I talked about, a lot of what we think of as North America was actually first in terms of exploration of the peoples who already lived here. We'll talk in the next class about indigenous societies and people who were here, we might refer to as First Nations or Native Americans. But in terms of European exploration, a lot of that was carried out by the Spanish and the Portuguese, even in what we consider to be North America. So if you look at this map, this is sort of exploration coming in, Spanish exploration up until sort of the Declaration of Independence in the 1790s. You see, you know, the Spanish occupying, of course, most of Florida, but had sailed up as far north as what is now Alaska, and had established various outposts all along these areas. And so a lot of these places were speaking Spanish in some ways long before they were ever anglicized or speaking English. And, you know, I don't want to leave out the French here either. A lot of people don't want to take French anymore, but it's super useful. The French are actually an important source of exploration and colonization. And we'll talk about this in terms of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. The whole French settlement here and the way in which they had sort of explored and traded and laid claim to this area west of what was the British colonies, could very well have stood in the way of what we think of as natural US expansion, were it not for the Haitian Revolution. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But I just want to throw the French in there, in part because, as we'll see in a second, the French are also one of the main people who were promoting the idea of a Latin America. So the idea of Latinidad, of being Latin, was actually something that was kind of a French idea that was being proposed. So we don't want to leave out sort of how much French influence there was in North America as well as different parts of Latin America. So at this point, I want to pause a second and ask a somewhat a question, I guess I would say, is that we run into a little bit of an, we might call it an issue or a paradox. If it turns out that the United States and Canada and all these places are like tangled up and interwoven together, then what do we do with the notion of cultures, or the idea that what we're studying are the peoples and cultures of Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the official title of this class? What do you do with the notion of culture, and why are anthropologists involved in this? And I'm going to put up a long quote. Like I said, you shouldn't write all the quotes down because I'll give them to you. This is a quote from Sidney Mintz, who is an anthropologist and is one of the first anthropologists to actually study in what you might consider to be a Latin American locale, but he wasn't trying to study indigenous peoples or native peoples or peoples who were kind of the peoples that most of us think about when we think about what anthropology studies. So this was during the 1950s and 1960s, and Sidney Mintz was doing field work in Puerto Rico. He would later on to go to do field work in Haiti, and as well as Jamaica. And he was one of the main influences on me, and also I think on our textbook author, Harry Sanabria. We'll see some more of Mintz as we go along. But this is something that Mintz wrote about when he was reflecting on how his fieldwork was seen within anthropology. So that he was in a place where people were making houses out of old Coca-Cola signs, where they were eating stuff that had canned corned beef and imported Spanish olives, ritual shot through with the cross and palm leaf, basically Catholic, all observed within the reach of radio and television. These are not the things anthropologists' dreams are made of. Which is to say, what he was trying to get at here is people often imagine that what anthropology dreams about is studying that isolated, far-off culture that's never been discovered and has no Western influence and no influence from the outside. And so Mintz and some of his other people around that time were the first to kind of reorient anthropology toward trying to study contemporary peoples and their insertion into the capitalist system. And like you said, this is not the stuff that people imagined anthropologists would be doing. Now we do it all the time, although I imagine for some of you, it is also probably new to think about anthropology in this way. So what do we do with this idea of culture in a context in which we know people are interwoven? Sanabria is going to tell us that culture is part of an approach which is embedded in or part of a political economic or political economy approach, which is to say that culture, or I think is to say, that culture helps us to understand how people make their own lives. That is to say, we know through understanding the anthropological concept of culture that people's possibilities aren't determined by their biology, by their race, by their environment, that there's this other element of human creativity and possibility which comes from what we learn, and we are able to learn and transmit and socially share. So it's hugely important to know that the people are not destined to be a certain way just because they live in a certain environment or because they look a certain way. It's because of the way in which we were socialized, raised, and culture. And so it can be enormously important in that sense. However, we can get in trouble if we think about culture as something that has a boundary, that is isolated, and that never moves, and they don't talk to each other, or it determines everything in your life. So if you, the moment you say, well, in their culture, they do X, you're probably going to get yourself in trouble because you're making a generalization about a whole range of people. And if you go back and take that generalization and apply it to your own life and ask, well, if I heard somebody say, in the Hartwick College culture, they do this, would I feel that was representative of what I am like? Then you can kind of get a sense of what kind of danger you might be in. So, important point here is that people interact with each other. They connect, they talk, they trade, they do all these things, and that's how they create difference. It's not through being isolated. It's not through being cut off. Throughout history, the peoples who were isolated and cut off usually died. So people are constantly generating difference. They're constantly looking at others and either bringing them closer to each other or describing themselves as different, but it's done through connecting to people and interacting. It's part of a sort of a life process. And so whenever we want to talk about history, culture, I would ask you to not use culture as a substitute for always pay attention to history, that is to say the historical source of what these things are coming from, to inequality, both between different societies and within a society, and to power relationships. Who is deciding what is important in any sort of cultural group? Or a different way to think about it is to always be hip, to always pay attention to history, inequality, and power. So whenever anybody says something about culture, even as an anthropologist, I want to be sort of thinking about, well, what's going on there? Why are they talking about culture here? Let me give you an example. There is a misconception about immigration, which I make a point of talking about in all of my classes, so some of you may have heard this before. So there's a misconception about immigration in the United States, and it comes from, let's put it bluntly, people like me with last names like Ambrosio. And the idea is this, that we, back in the day that immigrated here, I don't know, a century ago, learned English and assimilated, but the new immigrants, these people who are showing up now, they just won't learn English. This is a common misconception, and it's something that people attribute to the idea of culture. Somehow that they have a different culture and they won't learn, they won't assimilate, they can't assimilate, right? So, if you look back historically in the United States, every immigrant group that has come in has been accused of the same thing, Germans back in the day of Benjamin Franklin when they were living in Pennsylvania. Ben Franklin was mad at them for not learning English fast enough. Italians accused of this all over the place, not learning English, not assimilating, being too Catholic, eating too much garlic. They've been accused of not learning English. But when we look at what happens in the world today and all through history, every immigrant group, this is how the world, or this is how immigration works. In the first generation of immigrants, of course, they are going to speak the language of wherever they were from, language or languages. I shouldn't say that they're monolingual to their origin country because they may have speak 2 or more languages before they even arrive in the United States. We're famously monolingual here in the United States, but in other countries, people often speak 2 or 3 languages before they even get here. The second generation, the children of the immigrants, are always going to be bilingual, and they may speak some or might speak a lot of their parents' language. That's just the way things always work. By the third generation, the children, grandchildren now, of those immigrants are almost always completely monolingual in English. They don't speak whatever it was their grandparents spoke at all. And so in some ways, or in lots of ways, sociologists have called the United States a language graveyard because people lose their language abilities here in the United States. I'll give you an example. My grandparents were from Italy, spoke, well, they didn't actually speak Italian, they spoke a dialect of something that was over there. My father grew up, he can't speak Italian, he could understand his parents when they talked, but he was basically monolingual English. And then there's me, nothing. Got no Italian at all. Had nothing growing up. Got married. When I got married, my wife, her parents were actually first generation immigrants from South Korea. So they spoke Korean, but she grew up in Queens and New Jersey. So she can speak some Korean, but is completely, mostly, or completely English speaking with a little bit of Korean. And our kids, oh man, pure upstate Oneonta, New York English. No Korean, no Italian, none of that stuff. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I had globe-trotting kids who could speak Italian, Korean, English, maybe some Spanish too, since I can speak a little bit of that. But no, monolingual English, trying to learn some other languages. And so it's interesting here because a lot of people have these, a lot of states are trying to put in these English only laws. That's what happens anyway. And it happens to, if you look at today's immigrants, if you look at, their families, there's a little bit sometimes because of travel and YouTube and all that stuff, there might be a little bit more interaction going on. But for the most part, this pattern happens over and over again. And you only have to look at what generation the people are to figure out how much English they're going to have. Yeah, Brendan.
Didn't it say in the reading that for like the English only ones, there's about like 20 states like already like doing that or something like that?
The English only laws have been passed in more states than I would like to count. I mean, and like I said, it's weird to me because it's like, well, aren't we supposed to be? Well, shouldn't we value? This would be a good thing, right? To be able to communicate with people from other societies. I mean, we're so fiercely monolingual in the United States, even if we don't have those laws. So why do we need these laws? Some of you in your post said, why, why do people in the United States think that immigration or is the downfall of American society, or that these, the integration of different customs is going to threaten our, I don't know what. I have to say, it's hard for me to even answer that because I don't understand it. So I'm probably not the best person to answer it. And in this class, I'm just going to assume that we don't believe that. I'm just going to be like, if I have to fight somebody on this stuff, I guess I will. But for this class, we're just going to assume that it's probably a good idea to get to know other people and the way they do things and think, and that it enriches our lives instead of detracts from it, degrades from it, destroys us. I don't get it. I don't understand it. So, like I said, I guess if there's somebody who wants to fight about this, I can try, but I don't want to. It doesn't make sense to me. I'm just going to move on. We are learning about in order to try and understand and also to sort of enrich our lives. Anyway, I won't make you fight me now. You can fight me later. But that's where I come from. That's where I'm thinking of coming from right now. I mean, I'll be honest, it's been a tough 4 years to be in anthropology. It's been tough. It's just like we have a person in office who apparently never learned how to spell, talk, and is regularly saying bad things about the people that anthropologists like to study and think about. So, hoping, like many of you, probably hoping for other forms of thinking. All right, anyway. Let's transition from there. Don't want to get off base and crash the computer or something. So, we've talked about how the United States, Canada, and all these places in the Americas, and it's a major theme of the class, are interwoven or interconnected. Then, I think, interestingly, Sanabria goes into some of the landscapes and regions in Latin America, starting on about page 11. The trying to describe them from sort of a geographic or climate and ecological point of view. And I'm not going to march through those one at a time. As we study some of these places, as we get into them a little bit, we'll talk about perhaps some of the things that make them the way they are. But what the main thing I want you to get out of that is how incredibly varied these areas are. So, Mexico is a huge place. There's lots of different landscapes and ecologies in Mexico. Brazil, enormous place. Argentina, and so you can kind of go along in these places and see mountains and forests, and then you see plains. I mean, it is an incredibly varied landscape. And, I think that one of the other things that Sanabria is trying to point out is that you have this incredibly varied landscape, which is important for how people make a livelihood, what they can grow, what they can do, how they're able to survive, what they're able to trade, how easy it is to get things from place to place. But it's not going to be entirely determining of the kind of culture, the people who settle in that place, the people who make up that place, and the language that is spoken, and how much variation there is around the languages. And this is a point that Alexandra made in her web post, talking about how she got to Mexico. Alexandra, you want to tell us anything about that? See if I can unmute.
I just got back last Tuesday from Mexico, so I'm stuck in quarantine.
How are you going to Mexico? I don't even understand that.
We went for an early spring break-ish kind of thing.
Okay, so what do you see there? Tell us about it.
We went to Tulum and we got to see the Mayan ruins, and they were very, very beautiful. It's very like vast, and they've been like doing work on them, so it's not exactly the same as it used to be, but it's beautiful.
All right, cool. So Alexander had some comments about kind of this interweaving of landscape with culture and material, and we'll talk about a little bit more in the next class about some of those pre-Hispanic formations. So Sanabria asks us then, or I'm going to ask, well, then what is Latin America and the Caribbean? Now, this might seem like a strange question, but it's important for our purposes. What are we actually studying? And the reason we have to ask that question is because what we see when we look at the landscapes, what we see when we look at the culture and the linguistic interconnection, what Sanabria calls a melange, right? The mix. Given this huge mix-up of different landscapes and regions and peoples and cultures and languages, it is not surprising that scholars disagree which countries and territories are part of Latin America and the Caribbean. So we start off here kind of, we thought we knew what we were studying, but now all of a sudden Sanabria is telling us that we may need to think about that a little bit. So what happens here is a process of imagining and inventing Latin America, partly through, a lot of times through linguistic characteristics. So what language is spoken, the idea of speaking a Latin-derived language is in part one of the formative ideas of what constitutes being in Latin America, and map making, or where people are shown on a map or located on a map. And so Sanabria tells us that Latin American and Caribbean is a cultural, historical, and social construction. And for those of you who've been in anthropology for a while, these are probably phrases that you hear a lot, that such and such is a cultural or a social construction, which is to say, it's not that there aren't real land masses south of the Rio Grande and the border, but where we draw those lines and what kind of borders and placements we make around them is something we do as a society, and we put these ideas onto the landscape. They are not given forever and ever. They are made up by us. And interestingly, like we were talking about before, the whole idea of being Latin was something that the French were interested in part because, they have a sort of also feel like they have a Latin-derived language. And it was seen as kind of against US influence in the region. So this sort of promotion of being Latin, of being linked to Latin America, is something that comes to us, I don't know, it's a fairly recent idea in terms of, maybe 100 to 200 years at most. Like, people would not have imagined themselves as Latin American 300 years ago. So I want to just sort of give you an example of, kind of some of these debates about what we should be studying. So when I typed into Google, map of Latin America, this is one of the first things that came up. I'll tell you about a couple more things that came up from that. But here's our map, and just want to ask, should we include what places should we include in the idea of Latin America? So a lot of people, like I said, would go with everything south of the United States is just in Latin America. So anything below that green line comes into Latin America. But some people would get nervous about saying Brazil should be part of Latin America. Why might we be like Brazil? I don't know.
They don't speak Spanish.
They don't speak Spanish. They speak Portuguese, which is not exactly, it's kind of Latin derived too, but not in the same way. And so, I mean, for those of you who know people who are Brazilian, they actually come into the US Census, for example. In the US Census, we ask everybody if they are Hispanic or not. Right? What do Brazilians say? I mean, they definitely, now that, on that issue, you would say no. Do they speak a Latin-derived language in Portuguese? Maybe. So, most people would probably include Brazil in Latin America, but, obviously this, we run into issues right there with the biggest country and the biggest, oops, I don't want to go that far. Suriname, also a language issue of exclusion. Does anybody know what language they speak in Suriname predominantly? I didn't know where Suriname is.
Like above Brazil.
Yeah, okay. So these three places, they're actually not all countries, we're going to talk about each of them. Suriname was originally called Dutch Guyana. So they actually, I mean, it's complicated, but they speak a decent amount of Dutch there. So yeah, so it's not, definitely not, would be, some people would say Latin America. And then there's French Guiana, which is actually not an independent country. It is still considered a department of France. And so I actually found this out again when I was looking at the global coronavirus figures. They had a terrible run-up still in coronavirus numbers in French Guiana, and it was getting included in the French numbers because it's not, it is the only remaining European colony in the landmass of South America. There are some others in Martinique is also not independent. There's some others in the Caribbean, but that was an interesting little tidbit. So, should French Guiana be part of Latin America? Well, in some ways, yes, because right, they're speaking French, and the French were into this at the beginning. I guess I should also mention Guyana, which was once called British Guyana, and they speak mostly English there, which leads us to our next one, Belize. Or as my dad used to say, whatever happened to British Honduras? So what was once Belize, and there it is, that little blue place east of Guatemala, was once called British Honduras, and they still speak a decent amount of English there. So when I was looking up maps of Latin America, there was one map that included all these countries except they excluded Suriname, Belize, and Guyana because Dutch and English just didn't seem to work. So, we're going to include them, but I just mentioned that. If we're going to include these countries, though, why don't we throw in New Mexico? I mean, it's a predominantly Spanish speaking. It's got the name Mexico in it. Why? That should definitely be part of Latin America. Or as one of my professors used to say, come on, Latin America, there's no place that is more Latin America than Quebec. Come on, those old Latin cathedrals and stuff like that. We're not going to include Quebec, but I just throw that out there to kind of help us to think about, okay, what should and shouldn't be in Latin America. So, we are also doing the Caribbean in this class. Now, it's interesting because some people don't even do the Caribbean in Latin America. I've had whole classes that are just called, the peoples and cultures of Latin America, and they ignore the Caribbean entirely. which is not what we're going to do because Santa Bria doesn't. Interestingly, some people will not include the Caribbean, or they'll leave out the Caribbean islands, but they'll keep in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Why would they do that?
Is it because they're the most known Caribbean island?
Well, let's see. Well, it's interesting because Puerto Rico, of course, is officially a part of the United States. Cuba is one of the biggest islands. Dominican Republic's on the east side of, yeah. What do you got? Gabe, tell us.
I was just gonna say that the three largest.
We'll have to get to our map of the Caribbean to figure out if that's true. And I guess if you included Hispaniola, sort of Dominican Republic and Haiti, but it wouldn't be larger than Jamaica, three largest. Close. What do you notice about those three places?
Is it because they're like closest to Latin America?
Oh, sorry. Yep, I thought somebody would know this. All right. They are the three Spanish-speaking Caribbean islands, right? So, you know, the other side of the island the Dominican Republic is on, Haiti is French-speaking, Jamaica, basically English. So, you know, some people would include them just because they speak Spanish, otherwise so interestingly, Santa Bria includes the Caribbean, but when you get down to it, Gabe, what does he leave out?
When he's talking about like the ecology and like the physiological like parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, he completely leaves out the Caribbean.
It's like it's gone. I had to go back and check. You're absolutely right. It's like he cut it off. It's like he was supposed to get there and then they cut it out.
3 pages in the chapter. I was like, skip over them.
Right. Yeah, so they're in the textbook title, but in terms of the physiogeographic regions, they don't even come in. So we'll bring them in for a little bit. There is the Caribbean Sea, maybe because it's mostly water. I don't know. The Caribbean Sea. But there you have it. Cuba. So you have Cuba. That is pretty big. Let me see. There's the Dominican Republic on the eastern side of what was once the island of Hispaniola. There's Haiti, which is mostly French-speaking, Jamaica, which is mostly English-speaking, and there's Puerto Rico. Yeah, I'm just trying to think if they're the three biggest islands. No, look, I think Jamaica is bigger than Puerto Rico. What do you think? Yeah, I would say so. Land mass area. So it's mostly those three places are included because they speak Spanish. The Caribbean is a fascinating place, and we could have a whole class on the Caribbean. Sid Mintz used to teach one on the Caribbean. You could spend your whole time doing that, in part because, it's one of the first areas in which Western colonialism was really unleashed with a vengeance. And so some people call it the West Indies because Columbus didn't know where he was. And so it became known as the West Indies. That's how we get the word Indian. Some people call these islands the Greater Antilles, and these islands the Lesser Antilles. And there's a whole interesting island chain going on here. And then other people would like to think about a sort of Greater Caribbean. And so, think about places like Florida and New Orleans and this part of Mexico, Belize, Honduras, parts of Nicaragua, the northern Panamanian coast, northern Colombia, northern Venezuela, those three places we talked about, because all of those places were kind of drawn into a Caribbean style economy, sugarcane production. Many of them tried to import many enslaved Africans into that area. And so some people think about the Caribbean as being a sort of larger area than simply these islands. It's difficult to sort of to think about you know, it is also a varied geography. It makes a lot of difference if you're growing up on a place like Cuba versus if you're growing up on, say, Grenada or Trinidad and Tobago. It's going to be a very different experience of being in the Caribbean than in other places. So I wanted to bring that up. Good call there, Gabe, on how it got skipped. So I just want to wrap this part up by talking about some things. Although we've been talking about the diversity, and that is extremely important about Latin America, there are a few interesting sort of general points we might make about the area we're studying. Latin American, Caribbean countries have generally been, are generally young in terms of their population. So Santa Bria mentions that about a third or 19 years or younger, a third of the population. I would say that the fertility rate and the mortality rates were, at least until recently, going down quite drastically, even from when Santa Bria wrote the book. A lot of people, when they think about Latin America and the Caribbean, you saw it a little bit in the film we saw yesterday about, you know, the idea of poverty and inequality. And this is true, but I would say that, you know, it's another way in which we're interwoven. Some of the rates of inequality and poverty are about what you would see in the United States in the now. And so, you know, I mean, I think this has sort of been a classic theme of people who go to Latin America and they're like, oh, there's so much poverty, there's so much inequality. Usually you don't have to go that far to see that anymore. And some countries have made strides to reduce that as well. Interestingly, Latin America, about 80% of the population lives in urban areas. So I think this is an important just fact to keep in mind, because often us anthropologists, we like to go off into the rural areas or the farming areas and, you know, explore some of the backwoods country. But it is a very urban population, and that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about immigration and internal migration from rural areas into urban areas. So there's a kind of overview of Latin America so far. How are we doing on time?